and welcome back to Book and Page. We are still talking about Richard III today, and we're actually on to the later sections of the play into Act 4. Today's video will be about scenes 1, 2, and 3 of Act 4. We'll start with a brief summary, as always, of what happens in these scenes, and then talk about things a little bit deeper. Let's get started with scene 1. The women are here. So the Duchess of York, the previous queen, Edward's queen, not the previous queen, and Anne is also here. She's now Richard's wife. Yay! No one's celebrating this. Turns out they've all come to the Tower of London to visit the princes. They're reassured the princes are fine, and then are refused access to them, despite being their mother, their grandmother, and their aunt. Exactly. And then the Earl of Derby shows up to basically say to Anne, hey, Richard's king now, you gotta come get crowned as his queen. Poor Anne is really not feeling this. She actually hopes that she dies before she's crowned, and very happily curses herself for that. She fully admits that she should not have fallen for Richard, but she did, and the other women are surprisingly supportive of her and basically say you gotta go. So the women all part ways, Anne to go meet with Richard, the queen to go and find sanctuary, and the Duchess claims at over 80 she's probably just gonna go die. Scene 2, we actually switch to Richard's perspective, and this is probably right after the coronation, which you can't show on Elizabethan stages. So, Richard's now king. He's gotten here with the help of Buckingham. That's about to fall to pieces, because Richard wants to kill the princes in the tower so that they don't become king and dethrone him. Buckingham seems hesitant about this, and actually steps out for a moment to catch his breath. Not a great thing to do around Richard, who very happily calls on a man Tyrell, who would be willing to kill the princes for him, and plans a lot of other things. Here's the basic setup. He's going to marry off Clarence's daughter to some low-born person, kill the princes in the tower, kill his wife, who he spread information about being sick, so that's not super suspicious, and marry his niece, Edward's daughter Elizabeth. Excellent. Perfect. Buckingham comes back in and says, look, I'm pretty sure that you owe me an earlship for getting you here. But Richard's a little focused on other things. He might have established how he's going to kill the princes, but he's got another enemy, a man named Richmond, who's also after Elizabeth, that he's a little too concerned about right now. Buckingham, get out of here, you're bothering me, I'm not in a giving mood. And Richard leaves. Buckingham decides now is the time to retreat while his head is still attached. Probably a good choice. And scene 3, we really start to go downhill when Tyrell shows up, having helped kill the princes with apparently 2 other murderers. Some of them are starting to feel a little bit of remorse. Richard's not, though. He wants to hear about how they died in more detail. But later. He's got stuff to work with right now. He sort of reiterates exactly what's happened. He's been a busy boy. He has effectively married off Clarence's daughter, imprisoned her son, the princes are now dead, and he's off to woo Elizabeth. 'Cause that's not creepy at all. Turns out, though, while Richard has been busy, so has his enemy Richmond, and even Buckingham. Richmond is gaining allies, and Buckingham has apparently fielded an army. Poor Richard's just sort of like, well, guess we gotta act fast, and it comes across a little more like, well, here I go killing again, than really maybe it should at this point. We're starting to get to the end game of this play. There's a lot of bodies. I mean, they're not on stage like something in Hamlet, but there's a lot of bodies, because it turns out Anne's also dead. Yeah, that's literally just dropped in a single line. My wife has said goodnight to the world. Thanks for that, Richard, you dick. So, let's talk about these scenes in a little more detail. Because, surprisingly, Well, a bunch of these scenes are sort of reiterating things. We also get some new information. Richmond's becoming sort of the big enemy at this point in time because we've killed off most of the other enemies so far. But we don't start the scene with Richard. We actually start the scene with the women. And this seems a little odd, especially since effectively we've kind of killed two of them off. The Duchess has just basically said she's going to go die. And Anne, by the end of scene 3, has just been offed off stage somewhere. Don't even need to address that. Anne is dead. So why do we start with this scene of them at the tower? Well, there's a couple reasons, I think, and some of them really pair up well with later things that we see. One, this is sort of one of those pity moments where the women come in and we basically all know that none of them are going to win anything here. They've all been put in terrible positions and they're all going to lose in some way. Anne's going to die. The Duchess have to deal with the fact that 2 of her sons are dead and the 3rd is a snake. The previous queen, very next scene, her 2 sons are dead, and Richard's planning on courting her daughter, which is not exactly like, yeah, no, my daughter got married to my husband's brother. So this is sort of this build up to the pity really performed on stage so that when Richard starts making mistakes, that has meaning for us. Because we've seen the women who are suffering because of Richard, and that has meaning for us. Because in truth, maybe if we put the little boys on stage and then killed them, that would help. But death scenes on stage are never super easy to really do. It's a lot easier to perform a lot of that violence off stage and then have somebody come in and tell you about it. So again, having the women there is a really concrete example that we as the audience can hold on to. So when Richard gets his comeuppance in the end, we say, and that's why, right? Those women suffered because of you. And we're happy to see his downfall because these women are personifying the suffering that is happening in really meaningful ways. And this is paired up really well then with the fact that, like, Tyrell comes on and is talking about this murder of the little boys. And again, we have this strange little repeat of Clarence's killing, where we have these murderers who are more remorseful of what they've done than, like, the high-born people that have sent them to do these things. So the women are actually paired off a couple of times with other bits throughout these scenes. And most notably, I find, in a lot of ways, they're paired up with that remorseful murderer type of sense. Because they can understand that need for pity and that need for mercy and letting go of power that the murderers are then feeling that the upper-born gentlemen aren't. Like, Richard doesn't think about that. Again, he kills his wife and just, it's a single sentence, and said goodnight to the world, and you're just sort of like, you feel nothing. You feel nothing for any of these people. So by allowing the women to show their suffering, having Richard then ignore that, but the murderers sort of take it up and understand it in a lot of ways and feel guilt and remorse, it's this very interesting sort of exploration of human nature in a lot of really weird ways. Because the powerful are not the people that you're rooting for in these moments. In fact, it's the exact opposite. You are rooting for these powerful people to be defeated. You're rooting for these powerful people to be rejected and dismissed. Because you see how little power any of these women have. And you see the remorse of people who are given a little bit of power and use it in the wrong ways. And suddenly Richard is precisely the bad guy. Not because he's admitted to being the villain, but because he legitimately just doesn't feel any of the emotions that you as an audience member, as an invested audience member, are likely feeling right now. You should feel bad for these women who are stuck and know full well how absolutely destroyed by the end of this play they're going to be. None of these women are going to get out unscathed. But they have to move forward and meet it. So Richard just taking all of the power for himself and then failing anyways is much stronger when you see how much collateral damage has been done to absolutely innocent people. You see it in Clarence's murder and the murder of the princes in the tower, and the women personified on stage, weeping for their children, their fathers, their husbands, and themselves. And that's the other really interesting thing about this scene, is these women come together. There is no blame towards anybody else. No one turns to the Duchess of York and says, "You bore this man." No one turns to Anne and said, "You married him." No one does that. We also don't have, like we had between Margaret and Queen, this sense of Anne usurping the previous Queen's position. There is no jealousy, envy, anger in this moment. All of these women recognize each other as human beings and as women in this moment who are suffering. They don't catfight. They don't insult each other. There is just this quiet understanding that they are stuck. So, when they all prove to be angriest at themselves, they step in and try to lessen that burden. The Duchess of York is the most aggressive towards herself for having bore Richard, and Anne is most aggressive towards herself for having married him and now being made the queen. And the previous queen actually steps in and says, "Do not wish harm upon yourself." It is this surprisingly quiet moment where these women all take each other's hands and recognize that they cannot be there for each other physically. None of them are going to get out of this situation. But they will part on equal standing. They will part as women who see each other as women. Not as somebody who was queen and another who will be queen. It is purely this moment where they connect with each other, forgive each other, and bless each other before they part. It is a surprisingly powerful moment for female camaraderie in a mainly male-dominated play, and they are actually the people that hold together the longest. This scene is paired up with the very next scene, scene 2, where we see Buckingham and Richard start doubting their partnership together and actually break apart. The women have this quiet moment where they go forth with the understanding of each other, even as they go forth to death. And Richard and Buckingham, having done terrible deeds to get where they are, now become suspicious and angry at each other. The women come together precisely in the moment where the men start to fall apart. And this is again because the women recognize they don't have power. The only comfort they can find is precisely in each other. Everything else has been stripped away from them. But Richard and Buckingham have built themselves so far up that they now have a major fear of all of this going wrong. In fact, a lot of people will tell you a tyrant's greatest fear is the people that have helped them get there and the people they've suppressed along the way. You constantly have to live in fear of your own people because they will be the ones who will rise up and take you out. So Richard's suspicion of Buckingham now is sort of historically a thing that happens. And Buckingham's suspicion of Richard is just intelligent for once in that man's life. Buckingham specifically recalls Hastings as somebody who was loyal to the crown, not to Richard, but loyal to the crown, and exactly what they did to that man. So Buckingham makes the choice that he is going to survive. The problem is, how too late is this decision? Did Buckingham stand more of a chance of surviving this play if he basically outed Richard at the very beginning and we just try and take him out? Like when everybody's still alive and coherent. But that's the problem. Is all of these men, and it is men within this play, the women are guilty of it a little bit earlier, but I think they learn something. I'm not sure the men do. The problem is that coherence probably wouldn't have been possible earlier in the play. Before they all had a common enemy in Richard, they were all squabbling together. Edward's attempt to bring them together in friendship is not super effective when you can very easily turn someone like Buckingham and even Hastings, who happily says, "I'm glad my political enemies are dead," like how easily they can turn on each other. It's not till Richard makes himself the villain so apparently to everybody that we start having some cohesion together. And even then, it doesn't necessarily seem to be cohesion in full groups. Richmond seems to be a big, powerful enemy, and he's gaining some followers, but Buckingham doesn't seem to have gone to Richmond. He is fielding his own army. Well, wouldn't they have more luck if Buckingham and Richmond got together? But how much can Richmond trust Buckingham, who's helped Richard this entire time? And that's something Buckingham has to recognize. So there's always going to be this suspicion among these male political groups. But the women, again, seem to have reached that point where they're beyond suspicion of each other, simply because they're all so trapped and in fear of their lives that they can group together because that's the only comfort they're going to have. But the men have power, and they think to themselves, if I just get enough power, I could survive all this. Buckingham might not team up with Richmond right away, simply because if I can defeat Richard on my own, then maybe I'm less likely to lose my head to my other possible ally because I teamed up with Richard originally. Once you have a little bit of power, you really want to keep it and keep yourself alive. So the women can come together because they precisely lack power, but the men, it's not happening. They're too suspicious of each other, so we're not getting cohesion. And this is sort of an interesting thing to watch happen across these scenes because we're precisely stripping everything away from Richard as we're doing this. The women group together and they're all stripped away. His allies are stripped away, but not together right away. And Richard is becoming singularly the focus of everyone's ire. So while he tried to act like at the start of the play he would be the focus the entire way, it really has sort of been this political and family drama up to this point where we've killed off enough people and we've split enough people apart that Richard is now singularly Richard, King Richard. which I think is what he aimed for originally, but he's now realizing how dangerous that position is actually. We see him, like, just starting to have his plans fall apart, and he's trying desperately to think of everything and cover everything. And this is really played up because he does tend to soliloquize and plan things out in detail. We've seen that previously. But he's starting to repeat himself. Between scene 2 and scene 3, he basically repeats the same thing of, these are the things I've got to do. These are the things I've done and still have to do. He's becoming less coherent. As he becomes this singular entity that everybody is focused on, he's losing his own focus. He's interrupting himself. He actually is meditating on Buckingham and then calls for the boy in the middle of it. And then goes back to meditating and then goes to talk to the boy. He is losing coherence and cohesion in himself, as we're seeing it forming and possibly forming in others. So as you strip the other characters off the stage and present Richard in a spotlight, it's like we present Richard with a magnifying glass, and you can suddenly start seeing all of the little fault lines that are just cracking and growing and expanding. Richard is becoming what he wants to become, except it's not what he actually wants. He had this image in his head of him singularly as king and in power, but he's losing everything that's actually gotten him to this point as he goes. That charisma, that ability to make other people think he's on their side, all of that is vanishing. He no longer has problems speaking about killing kids and marrying other kids. He is becoming the villain. I think in a lot of a more concrete way than he even thought he would be. The women start this act off by showing what happens to everybody else. All of the suffering when a tyrant takes power. And Richard, here and beyond here, is showing exactly how that tyrannical power in nature is going to destroy the tyrant himself. Richard, from here on out, is losing. And it doesn't matter who he kills. He is going to lose. Because he has no other path out. I've recently read Sun Tzu's The Art of War, and he notes that you always give retreating armies a path out. That way they're more likely to run than to fight. Sometimes we need to remember to do this for ourselves. Richard has not. He has no path out. He is purely and completely alone and stuck. He is not going to win this argument. He is not going to win this fight. Many others have suffered, and that suffering will come back on Richard tenfold. So, I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.